This is Now What? Life After Redundancy, when your job disappears, but you don't. Hello. I'm Stevie, and you're joining me on my journey through and hopefully past redundancy, where I'm regularly asking myself the question, now what? And if you're currently at the stage of the job search where you've started describing yourself as exploring opportunities to people at parties so you don't have to say the actual words, and if you've ever said I'm fairly flexible on salary in an interview and immediately know in your bones that you've just made a mistake, you're in the right place. This show is for anyone navigating redundancy or career transition. It's part practical, part perspective, and part pep talk without the cringe. Each week, I work through the stuff that actually makes this period hard, which is actually turning out to be a bit of a longer list than anyone kind of warned me about. Today, we're talking about salary conversations, specifically why it's one of the most anxiety-producing moments in the entire job search process, and why it's even more loaded when you're coming from redundancy rather than a standard job move. We're going to look at the specific traps people fall into, most of which are completely understandable given the circumstances, and what actually useful preparation looks like before you're ever in the room. No negotiation bro overconfidence, no hedging so thoroughly it becomes useless, just a straight look at something most job search advice either oversimplifies or just skips entirely. It's worth sticking around for if you have an interview coming up, and probably worth a listen even if you haven't, because this conversation has a habit of arriving when you least expect it. But before we get into any of that, if you would like to support the show, if you find it useful, even for the merest of moments, the simplest thing you can do is follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. The only thing it costs you is the effort of moving your finger to tap, follow, or subscribe, and it genuinely helps the show reach other people who are also somewhere in this process. And while I've got you, if you're looking for somewhere to land during the search, somewhere where actual people are navigating the same thing rather than a wall of generic career advice, we've built something exactly for that. It's called The Invisible Queue, and you can find it at theinvisiblequeue.co.uk. There's a free forum, there are resources, and there are people in it who are at the various stages of the same journey. So come along and say hi. And finally, if you've got a story you want to share, a topic you think this show should cover, you just want to get in touch, you can do all of that at thenowwhat.co.uk. I read everything that comes in. Right then, that's enough of that. Let's get into it. There are films from your childhood that you remember being absolutely brilliant. And then there are films from your childhood that actually are absolutely brilliant. And I'm describing the difference between the old He-Man film and The Goonies. Now, The Goonies came out in 1985. It was directed by Richard Donner and produced by Steven Spielberg, and it's firmly in that second category, and I'm not taking questions on it. I watched it constantly as a kid. It had everything. There was adventure, friendship, a fairly terrifying family of criminals, a pirate ship in an underground cave, which at 9 years old, that was basically the most exciting sentence in the English language. There are things in it that naturally wouldn't make the screen today. I mean, I think of the Truffle Shuffle in particular, and that's a whole thing that probably warrants its own conversation about what the 80s thought was acceptable. But even setting those aside, the bones of that film are genuinely good. It holds up. I rewatched it on the weekend, and if we're in a friendly environment here, if I'm being completely honest, I napped through a portion of the middle section, and it's not because it was boring, but because it was Sunday afternoon and there was a sofa involved, and some of these decisions just make themselves. But I was, however, fully alert for the ending, because the ending is what I want to talk about. If you haven't seen it, and I'd encourage you to fix that, the whole film builds to the kids finding One-Eyed Willie's treasure. Real pirate gold, actual rubies, emeralds, and diamonds. The kind of haul that, by any reasonable measure, should solve everything. And the specific thing it needed to solve in the film was the Walsh's family mortgage. That debt had been hanging over the entire story and was the reason they were in that situation at all. So the treasure is real, the value of the treasure is real, nobody's disputing any of that. But when it comes to the moment of truth, no one's actually valued the gems that Mikey had. There's no jeweler on hand, no agreed rate, there's no clean translation between what was in the ship that the kids got away with and what's owed on the house. And Mr. Walsh tears up the paperwork in a moment of triumphant declaration. He screams there'll be no more signing now or ever again, which is a wonderful bit of cinema, but is quite presumptuous given that no one stopped to check whether what was in the marble bag actually covered the debt. So the treasure is real, the value is real, but what that value means in the specific moment under those specific circumstances is a completely different question that no one bothered to answer. And that gap between what something is genuinely worth and what a particular situation demands it to be worth right now is exactly what makes the salary conversation so difficult when you're coming from redundancy. Because most salary advice assumes that you're moving between jobs from a position of employment with a current salary acting as a clean anchor. You know what you earn, you add a reasonable amount of top for the inconvenience of moving, and you have a sense of the market because you're sitting in it. So the conversation is kind of uncomfortable, but it's navigable. Redundancy is taking away the anchor, or I guess if we're being technical, it kind of complicates it almost beyond use. Because your last salary exists, but it may not reflect what the market currently pays for your skills. It may not be relevant if you're deliberately targeting a different level of role. And the psychological pressure of actually needing a job change, what you're willing to say out loud, the number you'd give from a position of security is almost certainly not the same number you'd give when you're 3 months in and the savings are doing their best and this is the first role in weeks that you genuinely like the look of. So the pressure is real. And it's worth talking about because it's what drives most of the traps people fall into. And the first of those is undervaluing, because there's a version of gratitude that's entirely appropriate. Feeling genuinely pleased to be in a process for a role that you want is great. But gratitude could quietly slide into pricing yourself as though you should be thanking them for their consideration, which is a different thing entirely. You still have skills. Those skills still have a market rate. The fact that you're between jobs doesn't actually reduce the value of those skills, even if your brain is working really hard to convince you otherwise. But the other side of this is overvaluing through anchoring. If you're targeting roles at a slightly different level to the one you've left because you want more flexibility or the industry's change or you're making a deliberate lateral move, there is a version of this where you're still mentally pricing yourself against the seniority that you used to have rather than the role in front of you. And the conversation gets awkward fast when your number belongs to a position that isn't what's on the table. Then there's also giving into the silence and naming a number too early because not having an answer felt worse than having the wrong one. So silence in a professional conversation feels like failure, and you feel it. Well, I know I do. And frequently you'll fill it with a figure you haven't properly thought through, because thinking requires time and the question was just asked. So I've had this exact experience during my own redundancy and job search. One role I'd applied for had a salary figure in the job description. It was right there in the advert, clearly stated, and it was at a level I was comfortable with. So I had a conversation with the talent team for the company. And when they asked me about my salary expectations in that initial call, understandably, I said the number that they had in their own advert. I thought I was onto a winner here. It seemed logical. But they came back and told me that the salary was actually a range, and the figure listed on the advert was just at the top of the range. And I said, fine, no problem. And then they disappeared. I hope they're okay. They went completely quiet, and I spent the weeks following wondering whether if I'd have said a lower number, if it had moved things along, or if I'd somehow come across as someone who leads on salary rather than the role, or if it would have made no difference at all. They just lost interest for a completely unrelated reason. I will never actually know, but that uncertainty is its own kind of torture. my story there, it sits in good company. So according to the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, just over 40% of UK employers consistently share salary ranges in their external job adverts, which means that for the majority of applications, you're walking into that conversation without the basic information you need to answer it confidently. And there was research conducted by HR Data Hub across 2.8 million UK job adverts. They found that 1 in 4 still include no salary information at all. And that gap starts to sharpen at more senior levels, where just under 40% of employers are disclosing pay compared to just under 70% for frontline roles. Essentially, I'm saying the higher the role, the less likely you are to know what you're walking into. And there are 2 more little trapettes worth calling out because they're both well-intentioned but both largely ineffective. They tend to come from the right instincts but still land badly. And both of these things are things that we as applicants do when we're trying to handle the question of salary without fully committing to an answer. And the first is offering a range so wide it does the opposite of what you intend. So if a recruiter or a talent manager asks you what you're looking for and you say somewhere between 40 and 55,000, and that sounds to you like it's reasonable, like it's flexibility and that you've thought it through, what it's actually really communicating is that you haven't done enough research to know where in that range you belong, and you're hoping the question sorts itself out without you having to commit. And realistically, it doesn't sort itself out. It just means the other person is doing the maths on your behalf, and they're going to put you at the bottom of whatever range you gave them, because why wouldn't they? And the second is if you respond with, my salary demand is negotiable. And, for a moment there, I kind of feel a bit like James Bond. It feels like a sophisticated answer, like you're signaling openness rather than desperation. But there is a difference between that flexibility and the absence of a position, and negotiable on its own is the latter. It's the equivalent of a seller listing a house with no asking price and just saying offers considered in the window. It's technically true, but it's not particularly confidence-inspiring, and the person across the table wants a number to work with. Negotiable isn't a number. So what can we do about this? The thing I'm really keen to talk about is what useful preparation actually looks like. Because the starting point for your salary requirement is just building a credible range before you're ever asked the question. So it's not a fantasy number, and it's not the minimum floor you'd reluctantly accept. It's a range that you've actually researched and can stand behind confidently when someone asks you to say it out loud. Now, the site Glassdoor gets mentioned a lot, and it is fantastic for a rough steer, but it does tend to skew towards self-reported figures, and pesky American data bleeds in around the edges if you're not careful with your search. More useful for UK-based roles are Reed or Total Jobs, and both of them publish salary guides based on actually advertised positions rather than what people choose to submit about themselves. LinkedIn's Salary Insights, if you've got a premium subscription, gives you some aggregated figures from people in comparable roles, and the Office of National Statistics publishes an annual survey of hours and earnings, which is the most authoritative UK dataset going. There's like over 170,000 employee records. If you want to benchmark at a sector level rather than job title level, that could help you. Doesn't sound like the most exciting afternoon you'll ever have, but it's a more solid foundation than the Glassdoor number someone entered in 2019 and never updated. But beyond the data tools, job adverts themselves are truly useful and underused as a research source. Spend time reading listings for comparable roles, and I'm saying this to you, and if you're listening to this show, you have no doubt looked at a lot of job roles. So me telling you to spend time reading job listings is really not the most helpful thing, but in the context of the salary assessment, spend some time reading the job listings for those comparable roles, and it's not just the ones that you're applying for, but the broader field. Reed's 2024 data found that jobs that included salary information saw 60% more applications, which tells you something about how candidates vote with their attention when the pay is visible. And multiple data points from actual employers in your market are more reliable than any single salary checker. Plus, if you have a relationship with a recruiter in your sector, not necessarily one working on a live role for you, just someone you've spoken to and you get along with, it's totally reasonable to ask them what the market is currently paying for your skill set at your level. That conversation is normal. Recruiters have this information in their pockets, and most are truly happy to share it because it makes their job easier too. And once you have that range, the next question is what you do when you're asked first. When you're not ready to commit, we don't have enough information about the full package to know what the right number actually is. Now, you're allowed to ask a clarifying question before you give a figure. If a talent manager says to you, "What are your salary expectations?" you could very legitimately reply with, "I just want to make sure I'm anchoring to the right thing. Could you give me an idea of what the budgeted range looks like for this role?" You're not being evasive with that. It's a reasonable request. And most hiring managers or talent teams will answer that. And if they won't, if they come back with, "We'd rather know what you're looking for first," then you've got your previously researched answer and range, and you give a figure from the top third of it as your opening position. You don't give the ceiling, you don't give the floor, just somewhere in that top third. It gives you somewhere to move from without starting a conversation you can't recover. It's also worth being really clear about which version of that salary conversation you're actually in, because they aren't all the same. The question you have in a screening call is different to the question you're having after a final stage interview. Early on, you've got more latitude. You can stay in a range, you can ask what the budget looked like, so you can treat it just as a broad alignment check rather than commitment. But by the time you're at the final stage, that number needs to be real, because the gap between what you say and what you'll accept becomes really small really quickly. And folk can sometimes treat every version of the question with that final stage anxiety, and it makes the early conversation harder than they need to be. So just have an awareness of which stage you're in and calibrate accordingly. And on the gap between what you need and what you want, those two things are truly different numbers, and it helps to be clear about both before that conversation ever happens. Even if you only ever share one of the numbers, what you need is your floor, and that number below which the role just doesn't work regardless of how much you like it. What you want is what you're going to say yes to quickly and with enthusiasm and gusto. Knowing the difference between those two means you can navigate a gap without either lying or giving away your hand entirely. "I'm flexible within a range" means something when you're actually knowing what that range is. It means nothing when you haven't worked it out yet, which is when most people say it. And on walking away from a number that doesn't work, this is the conversation that gets genuinely difficult when you've been searching for a while. There's a version of the redundancy experience where that search has gone on long enough that the floor has quietly moved down a little bit without you properly noticing, and you kind of find yourself considering numbers that you'd have dismissed in month one. That's worth keeping an eye on. The floor should move deliberately based on a very clear-eyed assessment of your situation, not by erosion and not because the anxiety of a long search has slowly reframed what feels acceptable without you even consciously deciding to change it. Which brings me to an element of this that nobody wants to really think about, but everybody probably needs to. At some point during the search or during your redundancy navigation, and ideally before you're deep into a process rather than during one, it is entirely worth sitting down with your household budget and working out what you actually need to bring home each month to keep things in the green. Again, this isn't about what you'd like. This isn't about what you were on before. It's about what the bills, the mortgage, the rent, the food shop, the direct debits, the tooth fairy payments, the things that don't stop because you're between jobs, what all of that actually adds up to and what salary gets you there after the pesky tax stuff has come off. It's not always a comfortable exercise. It requires you to look at numbers that You might have been keeping at arm's length, but it's also the only way to arrive at a floor that's grounded in reality rather than your own anxieties. And there's a meaningful difference between those two. A floor that's built on your actual numbers is something you can negotiate from, but one that's built on a vague sense of what feels too low is much harder to hold when you're sitting across from someone whose offer is slightly below it and you genuinely want the role. If it helps to have a starting point, I built a redundancy runway calculator over on thenowwhat.co.uk. I pulled it together because I needed something like it myself and couldn't find anything that did the job simply. It is illustrative rather than financial advice, I have to stress that, but it just gives you a working picture on how long your current situation can hold and what your monthly take-home needs to be and what a salary acceptance needs to look like to make an offer clear. It's worth 5 minutes of your time before that conversation happens rather than after. One final thing, once you've accepted a number, whatever that number is, there's a version of this where the uncertainty doesn't fully go away. They gave you a number, you said yes, they said great, everyone shook hands, maybe high-fived, and somewhere in the back of your head, a quiet voice starts going, did I leave something on the table? Should I have pushed a bit harder? Would they have gone higher if I'd have held my ground for another 30 seconds? It is deeply annoying and almost entirely unproductive, but it's very, very common. And the antidote isn't certainty. You'll never fully know, but it's preparation. If you've gone into that conversation knowing your number, knowing your floor, knowing what the market pays, then whatever you agreed is a decision you have made rather than one that has been made at you. That's terrible English, but you get the idea. It's also worth having an appreciation that the fear most people have around these conversations is that pushing back on a number is going to cost them the offer. From my understanding, from the conversations I've had in my many networking chats, it is largely a misperception. There was research from RKY Careers suggesting that most UK employers set their initial offer below the top of their budget, with the majority of the roles carrying somewhere between a 5 and 15% negotiating room built in. So this isn't a negotiation script, and it's not a guarantee. Different employers will have different approaches. But it's just some useful context for that moment you're deciding whether or not to accept the first number that they provided you or ask a question about it. Most of the time, asking questions doesn't end the conversation. It just continues it. So what's the takeaway? I think the key thing I want to leave you with today is that the salary conversation isn't really about negotiation tactics. All the scripts and anchoring techniques and never name a number first rules in the world won't fix the underlying problem, which is redundancy specifically erodes two things you need for this conversation to go well: knowing your number and being willing to say it. And knowing your number means doing your research before you are in the room, so that the question doesn't catch you mid-calculation. And being willing to say it means understanding that your value hasn't changed because your employment status has, and that a prepared, reasonable answer delivered without an apology isn't aggressive, it's not presumptuous, and it won't get your offer pulled. It's just professional conversations between two people who both want it to go well. The situation you're in is not a negotiating weakness unless you decide it is. And on that note, we started this episode with the Goonies, so it feels only right to end there too. Because there is another moment at the end of the film that I think about more than the treasure. It's Chunk turning to Sloth, the enormous, gentle, misunderstood man he's just met, and telling him with complete sincerity and zero prior consultation that he's going to come and live at his house now. Just like that, fully committed, entirely confident, not a single conversation had with his parents about whether that's something they'd agree to, or if they were even aware it was being considered. Now, I'm not saying that the salary conversation requires the same level of unilateral enthusiasm, but there is something in that moment. The willingness to just say the thing, to commit to the number, to make the declaration without waiting for permission. And that is actually closer to the right energy than most of us manage when someone asks what we're looking for. Just perhaps with a slightly firmer grip on whether the adults in your life have signed it off first. Anyway, that's me done for today. No treasure map required for this bit, just hit follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you know someone who's navigating their own version of this, send them the episode. Not a grand gesture. It's just the thing that might make their week slightly more manageable. And if you're asking yourself now what, you're in the right place. Before you go, if any of this has been useful, please do me a favor and follow the show wherever you're listening. And if you've got 60 seconds and an opinion, leave a review. It helps other people find the show, and it also stops me wondering if I'm turning into some sort of audio hermit. And if you want more than just my voice turning up in your ears once a week, head to theinvisibleq.com. It's a support platform for people navigating redundancy, built by people who've actually been through it and remember how strange and exhausting the whole thing is. But for now, thank you for listening. Until next time.